All right, guys, welcome to the lecture on Chapter 22, Section 1, The Nation's Sick Economy. The objective for this lecture is to learn about the economic problems affecting industries, farmers, and consumers at home and abroad. And the essential question we're going to be asking ourselves is, what were the causes of the Great Depression? So obviously this lecture is on the heels of World War I and the Roaring Twenties, and we're going to be picking up in the 1920s, talking about the ensuing economic collapse at the very end of the 1920s, October 29th of 1929. Now, economic troubles were brewing during this time. You had your big industries, steels, textiles, and railroads, not really making as much profit. The last couple years of the 1920s, many of these industries were actually making a lot of surplus of goods. They had extra goods available in their warehouses to store, and people weren't really buying them as much as they were earlier in the 1920s. This should have been a sign of things to come, but a lot of industries continued to try to make it work and sell as much as they could to make up usually for the money they owed in loans for the expansion of their business. But it wasn't just these big industries that were suffering. Farmers were suffering greatly at this time too. And really World War I has a lot to do with both of these struggles. So let's start with farmers. Well, the farmers had grown a huge amount of crops during World War I, and they were feeding not only American soldiers, but they were exporting them to the world market to feed other Allied soldiers. And they were also feeding the people in the United States of America. And farmers were buying more equipment, they were buying more land, and in order to do that, they often had to take loans out from the bank. So they owed a certain payment back on their loan that they took out to buy new land or to buy new equipment for their farming. Well, when the war ended and the demand was not as high for their goods, farmers fell on really hard times. Congress passes price supports for farmers, which basically says we will buy whatever crops you don't sell, we will buy them at X price. And it also says that the consumer has to buy the crop at a certain price. And that tries to create a stable price for the crop. Now, some farmers would just try and grow more, which of course would make the price go down even further. One of the big issues, though, is that Calvin Coolidge did not support this idea of price supports for farmers, saying, quote, "Farmers have never made money. I don't believe we can do much about it." So the farming sector of the United States never really gets the help that they need, and because of that, that will have a ripple effect on the rest of society. Now, just like the farmers had sort of a boom and bust after World War I, these other industries had the same thing. Steel, textiles, and railroads all began not making profits after the war because they had expanded their businesses too far, and following World War I, they were not able, there was no demand to meet their huge supply. And just like the farmers, they had expanded their businesses, they had taken out loans, so they owed money back. So what we have here is we have the mass consumption economy and the increase of bad habits. And if we think back to the 1920s, in our last chapter talking about the societal attitudes of the 1920s, and people were spending more money on things that were sort of unimportant. They were spending more money on entertainment and clothing and food and consumer products like the car and the radio. And what's happening is people are becoming much more loose with their budget. And this type of mindset is going to bleed over into the stock market eventually, and it will get Americans in a lot of trouble. But we see the Roaring Twenties societal attitude having an effect on the economy by the end of the 1920s. So what we have is we have Ford's assembly line in the early 1920s, which is going to increase the production of goods. That's going to increase advertising. In addition to increasing the production, it's going to drive down the price, which will increase consumption. Because like I talked about, in the 20s, people had extra money and they were spending it. This will increase credit available, which will increase profits, and it is all a terrible cycle from there. You might be confused with what increasing credit means. Well, if more people are buying goods, then different companies are willing to actually sell those goods without all of the money up front. So if I'm a furniture company, I maybe will sell a sofa to someone, a $100 sofa with $20 down, and then put them on a payment plan moving forward. So this person just bought a $100 item for only $20, which unless you can really guarantee you can pay that other $80 off in a timely fashion, that's an irresponsible investment to make, but one that was pretty common during the 1920s. But businesses like to do that because it increased their profit. It basically, they sold their $100 item to a person who otherwise couldn't afford it, and not only that, when they pay the $80 back, they'll pay back with interest. So at least in the short term, it's good for both the consumer who gets their item and for the business who is able to sell it sooner than it otherwise would. But in the long term, you can imagine with too many people doing this, is going to create a bubble within the United States economy, making it look like there's more money available than there really is. In the presidential election of 1928, you have Herbert Hoover, a Republican, crushing the Democrat from New York, Al Smith, for a couple different reasons. Everything was going great in the 1920s. We had Harding and Coolidge, both Republicans. Hoover was a member of their administration, so he really relied on the success of the 1920s to help him win the 1928 election. Alfred Smith dealt with a couple different things. He was a Democrat, he was anti-prohibition, he was also Catholic, which hurt him, and he had a thick Brooklyn accent. So all of these things were held against him and helped Herbert Hoover win the presidency. But soon after Herbert Hoover became president, the stock market crashed and the economy crashed, and all of these things that we've talked about for the first half of this lecture finally came to a head. But it happened in the stock market. So I spoke just a few minutes ago about the dangers of buying things on credit. Well, it's one thing to buy a piece of furniture on credit. It is far worse to buy a stock on credit. And what was happening is that consumers who were consuming all types of things like televisions and radios and furniture and cars, they were beginning to carry over that consumer mentality into the stock market. And so we can see this roaring 20s attitude taking over in the stock market. And people began to buy on margin. Buying on margin is basically like buying on credit. You're only paying a fraction or a margin of what the stock actually costs. So in theory, I can go to the bank and buy a $4 stock with only putting $1 down. And I will borrow the other $3 from the bank. Now, one would think that sounds like a bad idea to borrow up to 75% of the value of the stock. And it is a bad idea. But in the 1920s, it didn't seem like a bad idea because the stock market kept going up and up and up. And while some economists said that there's failure coming in the future, most economists, many very notable, respected economists, said that they could see this continuing for a really long time. So people bought into it. And for the most part, a lot of small consumers of stocks, a lot of small investors in the stock market didn't buy stocks that they were super familiar with or very educated about. Oftentimes they will buy stocks based on speculation. And this is the idea that you will buy the stock for $4 a share tomorrow and hope it's up to $4.25 a share in a week. And then you can sell that and then you can profit the 25 cents. You pay back the $3 that you borrowed. You started with $1, borrowed $3 for a $4 stock. Now you have $1.25. And so you were able to just profit 25 cents off of a $4 stock that you couldn't really afford in the first place. But what that will do is that will make the investors much more volatile, right? It will make them much quicker to sell their stock. Because if you buy a $4 stock when only one of the $4 is yours and that stock starts to go down, you will want to sell it right away. You don't really know anything about the company, so you're not confident in your purchase. On top of that, you owe that $3 back to the person you borrowed it from. So you can't watch the stock continue to drop or else you won't have the money to pay them back. So what eventually happens is this availability of instant credit is going to lead to the stock market raising far above what it should. The value of a company's stock tells you how much you think the company will be worth in the future. But if everyone's just borrowing money and throwing it into the stock market, all of the values of these companies will be inflated beyond what they really are. And that's what eventually happened. Not only that, you had about 5% of the country worth about 5% of the population worth about 1/3 of all of the wealth, if not more. So you have a huge percentage of the population not worth as much of the wealth, not having as much free money. They can't buy the consumer goods. So all of these companies are getting these inflated stock prices, but they're not actually able to sell their goods to anyone because most of the money is held by the rich in society who don't buy your standard consumer goods like a small piece of furniture or a ton of food, right? Because it's just a few people, or a radio, or thousands of cars because it's just a few people with all this money. So all of these things led to Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. And actually, the previous Thursday, October 25th, 1929, there was a large drop in the stock market, about 10% loss, in which a lot of people sold their stocks. And so you could sort of see this coming. But by Tuesday, it dropped drastically. And the stock market crashed. And all of these bubbles, this fake value that had been built up on the stocks, finally burst when people began to sell their stocks and realized they're not really worth as much as they thought they were. The gross national product was cut in half. And Black Tuesday will begin the Great Depression, which will last for 12 years, all the way until 1941. The only thing that brings America truly out of the Great Depression is the outbreak or our involvement in World War II. Unemployment rises to 25%. You have the collapse of investment and banks, and you have what's called a bank run. Everyone runs to the bank to get their money. They see that the stock market's going down, and they want to get their cash out of the bank as quickly as possible. But I don't know if you know this, the banks don't actually hold on to your money, for the most part, when you deposit it. If you deposit $1,000 into your savings account, the bank takes your money and loans it out to someone else on interest. That's how the banks make money. So while the bank claimed to have had all of these people's savings, it really didn't. It had loaned the savings out to different businesses or farmers or people who were speculating on stocks, all of which is falling apart. So people run to the banks to get their savings. They're not able to get their savings, and tens of thousands of banks closed during this time, costing some people their entire lifetime savings, even when those people really didn't make irresponsible decisions. It was actually the fault of someone else. What eventually happens is the United States of America recognizes that they're struggling to get their business going again, and Congress passes the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which basically makes the tariff, which is a tax on imported goods, much higher. What this is designed to do is to keep European countries from sending goods over, importing goods to the United States. This will make United States consumers buy United States goods, thus kickstarting United States businesses. Great plan, right? Wrong. On the surface, it sounds like a great plan, but it actually backfired even more. Europe was a mess following World War I. You had countries in disarray, notably Germany, who owed millions of dollars in reparations it could not spend. And what happened is because these countries couldn't export goods to America, because the tariff was too high, they couldn't actually receive American dollars in return. And because they didn't have American dollars, they couldn't buy American goods. So not only can Europe not import goods into America, but America can't export any goods to Europe because Europe doesn't have the cash to buy it. This was essential to keep goods going back and forth between the U.S. and Europe and to keep both economies going. So this only made things worse. In 22.2, we're going to examine, well, how did President Hoover respond to this? And knowing that he's very fiscally conservative, and a Republican, it might not surprise you when I say that President Hoover did not have the best, fastest response to the stock market crash in the beginning of the Great Depression. And we'll examine that next section. If you have any questions, please, as always, feel free to ask your history teacher.